The air tasted like ash and iron. Vasily Zaitsev lay motionless in the rubble, his breath forming tiny clouds that vanished into the freezing November wind. Around him, the bones of Stalingrad jutted toward a colorless sky, twisted steel beams, shattered concrete, the hollow shells of buildings that had once held families, laughter, warmth. Now they held only ghosts and the living dead. His finger rested beside the trigger of his Mosin Nagant M91 over 30. Not on it. Not yet. Patience was the difference between life and death here, between drawing another breath and becoming another statistic in a war that consumed men like kindling. The rifle lay steady against his shoulder, its wood stock cold even through his threadbare gloves, its weight familiar as his own heartbeat. Somewhere across the wasteland of rubble, maybe 200 meters, maybe less, a German sniper waited. Vasily could feel him the way a shepherd feels the presence of a wolf. The German had been stalking this sector for 3 days, picking off Soviet soldiers with methodical precision. 7 men, 7 fathers, brothers, sons who would never see home again. Each one had made the fatal mistake of believing they understood the rhythm of this place, the deadly choreography of Stalingrad's ruins. The German had not made that mistake, but neither had Vasily. A mortar screamed overhead, and the world exploded in a cascade of brick and smoke. The blast waves slammed into Vasily's position, showering him with debris. His ears rang with a high, piercing tone that drowned out everything else. Through the haze of pulverized concrete, he kept his eye pressed to the telescopic sight, scanning, searching, waiting for the mistake that every man eventually makes. In Stalingrad, the average life expectancy was 24 hours. Vasily had been here for 47 days. The wind shifted, carrying with it the stench of cordite, and something worse, the sweet, sickening smell of decay that permeated every corner of this hell. Bodies lay frozen in the streets, some half buried in snow, others suspended in macabre poses where they had fallen. The cold preserved them, turned them into monuments to futility. The living moved between them like wraiths, too exhausted for reverence, too numb for horror. Vasily's position was a cavity in what had once been a grain elevator, now a skeletal tower of twisted metal and scorched concrete. Through the scope, he could see into the German positions, a labyrinth of trenches and fortified buildings, machine gun nests and mortar pits. The enemy had pushed into the city expecting a swift victory, and instead found themselves locked in a death grip they could neither win nor abandon. The Volga River lay frozen behind the Soviet lines, a white expanse that offered no escape. Between the river and the German advance lay men like Vasily, holding positions that existed only on maps, defending streets that had no names anymore, only numbers and designations that changed with each hour as territory was lost and reclaimed and lost again. His radio had died 2 days ago. His last meal had been a handful of frozen grain scraped from the elevator's walls. His canteen held water that had to be thawed against his body before he could drink it. But the rifle was perfect, clean, ready, waiting. Through the scope, a shape moved. Vasily's heartbeat slowed. His breathing ceased. In this moment, he became something other than human, a pure instrument of observation and calculation. The shape was wrong, too deliberate, too careful. A soldier crossing that space would move faster, would hunch lower. But this shape moved with the patience of a hunter. The German sniper, Vasily's finger moved to the trigger, but he did not apply pressure. Not yet. The range was extreme, perhaps 250 meters. The wind was gusting from the northeast, cold enough to numb exposed skin in minutes. The bullet would drop, would drift, would be affected by a dozen variables that had to be calculated not with mathematics, but with instinct, with the knowledge that lived in his bones. He had learned to shoot in a different world, a world so distant from this frozen hell that it might have been another planet entirely. The shepherd, the Ural Mountains, had been his first teacher. Vasily Grigorievich Zaitsev was born on the 23rd of March 1915 in a small village where wolves still hunted in winter, and the forests stretched unbroken to horizons that changed with the seasons. His grandfather was a hunter, a man whose hands told stories in scars and calluses, whose eyes could track a rabbit through snow that would blind a lesser man. As a child, Vasily had worked as a shepherd, tending flocks through the high pastures where eagles circled and the wind spoke in a language older than words. His grandfather had given him his first rifle when he was 12, an ancient weapon that kicked like a mule and smelled of gun oil and possibility. A rifle, his grandfather had said, running a weathered hand along the barrel, is only as good as the man who holds it, not his strength, not his courage, his patience. They would sit for hours in the forest, hidden in blinds they built from fallen branches and patience, waiting for deer that might never come. His grandfather taught him to read the wind by the way it moved through the pines, to judge distance by the sound of a stream, to know when to breathe and when to hold his breath until his lungs screamed for air. "You cannot force the shot," his grandfather would whisper. "You must let it happen. Feel the moment when everything aligns, the wind, the target, your heartbeat. In that moment, you do not pull the trigger. You simply release." Vasily had learned, through frozen dawns and summer twilights, through successful hunts and long days of returning empty-handed, he had learned to become invisible, to read the landscape like text, to understand that hunting was not about killing, but about knowledge, knowing the prey better than it knew itself, anticipating its movements before they happened, becoming a part of the natural order so complete that his presence was indistinguishable from the forest itself. Those skills had followed him when he left the mountains. In 1937, at 22, he had joined the Soviet Navy, serving in the Pacific Fleet. He had thought the war might pass him by, that he would spend his service maintaining equipment and standing watches on ships that never saw combat. Then the Germans came. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Operation Barbarossa shattered the peace with 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and a certainty that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. The Wehrmacht drove east with mechanical precision, encircling entire armies, capturing cities, pushing deeper into territory that stretched beyond comprehension. By autumn, they stood at the gates of Moscow. By summer of 1942, they had turned south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and a city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. Vasily had volunteered for transfer to the infantry. Some men sought glory, others sought death. Vasily sought something simpler, a chance to use the skills his grandfather had taught him, to become once more the hunter in the forest. Though the forest was now made of concrete and the prey wore Feldgrau and carried Mausers, he arrived on the 20th of September, 1942, crossing the Volga under artillery fire that turned the river into a cauldron of geysers and steam. The boat next to his took a direct hit, disintegrating in a flash of orange flame and flying debris. Men screamed, some from pain, others from the shock of sudden immersion in water so cold it stopped the heart. Vasily had gripped his rifle and kept his eyes on the western bank, where the ruins of Stalingrad rose like broken teeth against the smoke-filled sky. General Vasily Chuikov commanded the 62nd Army, the force defending Stalingrad with a desperation that bordered on madness. His orders were simple: hold the city at any cost, not a step back. Every building was a fortress. Every street was a killing ground. Every hour the Germans were delayed was an hour the Soviet Union could use to prepare, to reinforce, to survive. Vasily was assigned to the 284th Rifle Division, a unit that existed more on paper than in reality. Men died faster than they could be replaced. Positions changed hands multiple times in a single day. The front line was not a line at all, but a three-dimensional maze, where enemy and ally occupied different floors of the same building, where combat happened at distances measured in meters, sometimes in inches. And everywhere, the snipers, the Germans had brought their best marksmen, men who wore camouflage and moved like shadows, who could kill from distances that made conventional combat obsolete. They dominated the ruins, forcing Soviet soldiers to move only at night, to crawl rather than walk, to accept that every window might hide death Every pile of rubble might conceal a shooter who would end your life before you heard the shot. Chwaikov needed an answer. He found it in men like Vasily Zaitsev. The rifle. The Mosin Nagant M91/30 was not beautiful. It was not modern. Compared to the German Mauser Kar 98K, it was crude, heavy, its bolt action rough and unforgiving. But it was reliable in ways that transcended aesthetics. Vasily's rifle had been manufactured in 1938 at the Izhevsk arsenal, one of millions produced to arm the Red Army. Someone, an armorer with more skill than most, had mounted a PU telescopic sight, a modest 3.5x magnification scope that turned distant shapes into targets, that allowed a marksman to reach out across the shattered landscape and touch someone with finality. The rifle chambered the 7.62x54 mmR cartridge, a round with enough power to penetrate the steel helmets the Germans wore, enough velocity to remain lethal at ranges where most infantry rifles became ineffective. The bullet weighed roughly 150 grains and left the barrel at nearly 2,800 feet per second. At 200 meters, it could punch through a helmet, a skull, and exit the other side with enough energy remaining to kill a second man if they stood in line. Vasily had learned the rifle's personality the way a musician learns an instrument. He knew that it shot slightly high at 100 meters, that the trigger had a long take-up before the break, that the recoil pushed up and to the right if he didn't control it properly. He knew which ammunition lots shot most accurately, how temperature affected the powder burn, how to adjust for the declining pressure as altitude increased. But more than technical knowledge, he understood the rifle as an extension of himself. When he aimed, he did not think about windage or elevation. He simply looked at the target and knew felt in his body, in his bones, where the bullet would go. His grandfather had called it becoming the shot, a state where conscious thought fell away and only instinct remained. In Stalingrad, that instinct kept him alive. His first confirmed kill had come on his second day in the city. A German machine gunner had pinned down a Soviet squad trying to cross 9th January Square, now a wasteland of bomb craters and frozen corpses. The machine gun was positioned in a third-floor window, offering perfect fields of fire across the open ground. 3 men had tried to rush the position. 3 men had died. Vasily had found a hide in the wreckage of a tramcar, its sides still bearing faded advertisements for goods no longer available, promises of a normalcy that seemed fictional. He had waited, watching the window through his scope, patient as a stone. 2 hours passed. His legs cramped. His fingers grew numb despite his gloves. Still he waited. Then the German made his mistake. He had grown bored, or perhaps careless, convinced that the Soviets had given up on crossing the square. He lit a cigarette, the tiny flare of the match bright as a signal fire through Vasily's scope. For just a moment, his face was visible, shadowed by the distinctive shape of a German helmet. Vasily had exhaled halfway, held the remainder, felt his heartbeat slow to the rhythm of the universe. The crosshairs settled on the center of mass. His finger tightened on the trigger with the gentleness of a lover's touch. The rifle barked, slamming back against his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the German's head snap back, saw him drop from view. The machine gun fell silent. The Soviet squad crossed the square and took the building. Word spread. Chwaikov heard about the naval infantryman who shot like a hunter. Vasily was pulled from regular duty and designated a sniper, given better positions, better support, and a mission that was both simple and impossible. Kill Germans, as many as possible. Make them afraid. Make them understand that Stalingrad was not theirs, that every window held death, that the Russians would fight for every brick until nothing remained but corpses and memory. Vasily had accepted the mission without hesitation, without pride, without any emotion at all. He had become what the war needed him to be. By the end of October, he had killed 47 Germans. By mid-November, that number had climbed past 100. He developed tactics that other snipers studied and copied. He taught them to move in pairs, to use decoys, to wait for days if necessary, to think like prey in order to hunt predators. He learned the rhythms of the battlefield, the times when men grew careless just after dawn, when the cold made them seek shelter, at dusk, when the fading light played tricks on the eyes, during artillery barrages, when everyone assumed visibility was zero. He learned to read the German positions, to understand their rotation schedules, to identify officers by the quality of their uniforms, radiomen by the antennas they carried, machine gunners by the way they scanned for targets. And he learned that in Stalingrad, death wore many faces, but the most patient face usually won. The city of the dead. Stalingrad in November 1942 was not a city, but an open wound. The Luftwaffe had bombed it until the rubble itself was rubble, until streets disappeared beneath mountains of brick and timber and glass. Buildings that had stood for generations collapsed in seconds, their foundations cracked by high explosives, their walls consumed by incendiary bombs that created firestorms hot enough to melt steel. The Volga ran black with oil and blood. Bodies floated in the current, frozen in positions of final agony. Their uniforms, both German and Soviet, indistinguishable beneath layers of ice and mud. Rats thrived, growing fat on the abundance of flesh, their eyes gleaming in the darkness of basements and sewers. Crows circled overhead in flocks so large they cast shadows, their cries a constant soundtrack to the killing. Water came from shell craters, filtered through cloth and boiled when fuel permitted. Food came from captured German supplies or from rations brought across the Volga at night when the artillery fire slackened slightly and boats could make the crossing with odds approaching survival. Men ate whatever they could find, grain from the elevators, meat from horses dead of shrapnel or starvation, bread so hard it had to be soaked in water before teeth could break it. The cold was its own enemy. Men froze to death in their positions, their bodies discovered only when others tried to take the same spot. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, turned noses black, blinded men whose tears froze their eyelids shut. The Germans suffered worse, their uniforms designed for the quick victory that never came, their supply lines stretched thin by partisan attacks and the brutal reality of distance. In this environment, conventional military doctrine broke down. Tanks could not navigate the rubble. Artillery had trouble finding targets in the maze of ruins. Infantry assaults devolved into room-to-room battles, where grenades were more effective than rifles, where entrenching tools became weapons of desperate close combat, where men fought with a savagery that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. But snipers thrived. In the chaos, a skilled marksman became a force multiplier beyond all proportion to his resources. One man with a rifle and the patience to use it could halt an entire company, could deny the enemy a crucial street or building, could create a zone of death that existed solely in the minds of those who entered it. Vasily became a legend in the ruins. Soviet propaganda seized on him, publishing his exploits in newspapers and leaflets, using his image to rally troops and terrify Germans. They called him the Hunter, though he never used the title himself. To him, he was simply a soldier, doing his duty, using the skills his grandfather had taught him to survive one more day in a place where 24 hours was a lifetime. But the Germans noticed. They noticed when their men stopped moving carelessly, when officers began dying with perfect regularity, when machine gun positions that should have been secure suddenly fell silent, their crews dead from single shots that came from positions that should have been impossible. They noticed, and they responded. The duel, his name, if he had one, was never confirmed. Soviet records called him Heinz Thorwald, though whether that was real or propaganda remains uncertain. What is certain is that he existed, a German sniper of exceptional skill, possibly from the Berlin Sniper School, sent to Stalingrad with one mission: kill Vasily Zaitsev. The Germans had grown desperate. Vasily's success was not just tactical but psychological. Soviet soldiers fought harder knowing one of their own was hunting the hunters. German soldiers moved more cautiously, wasted ammunition firing at shadows, experienced a corrosive fear that sapped morale more effectively than any commissar's speech. So they sent their best. The duel began not with a shot, but with a message. A German soldier, killed by another sniper, was found with a note pinned to his uniform. "Zaitsev, I am here. Let us see who is better." Vasily had read the note without expression, then returned it to the body. The message was clear. This would not be a hunt, but a contest. Two men of equal skill testing themselves against each other in an arena of rubble and death. For 3 days, nothing happened. Vasily maintained his usual routine, moving between positions, taking shots when opportunities presented themselves. He killed a radio man on day 1, a machine gunner on day 2, an officer on day 3. Each shot was textbook perfect, 1 bullet, 1 kill, no wasted motion. But he felt the Germans' presence like pressure against his skull. On the 4th day, a Soviet sniper named Viktor Medvedev was killed. Single shot, through the head, from a position Vasily had used 2 days earlier. The German was tracking him, learning his patterns, his preferences, his methods. Viktor had been a good sniper, cautious and skilled. His death meant the German was better, or at least as good. Vasily changed his tactics. He abandoned his usual positions, moved at different times, varied his approach to targets. He began using decoys, helmets on sticks, dummies positioned to draw fire. The German did not fall for them. He was too experienced, too patient. Another Soviet sniper died. Then another. Chuikov summoned Vasily to his headquarters, a bunker carved into the bank of the Volga, its walls sweating condensation, its air thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. "This German," Chuikov said, his voice rough as gravel, "he is making fools of us. 3 of our best snipers dead in a week. The men are beginning to believe he is invincible." Vasily had said nothing, waiting. "I need him dead," Chuikov continued. "Not for propaganda, not for morale. I need him dead because he is killing men we cannot afford to lose. You understand?" "Yes, Comrade General." "Can you do it?" Vasily had met the general's eyes, eyes that had seen too much death, too much futility, eyes that still burned with the refusal to surrender. "Yes," Vasily had said, and meant it. The hunt, which brought him back to this moment, lying in the ruins of the grain elevator, his rifle trained on a shape that moved with the patience of a predator. A shape that might be the German sniper, or might be another trap in a contest that had no rules except survival. The shape paused. Through the scope, Vasily could see it was a soldier, Feldgrau uniform partially covered by a white smock for snow camouflage. The man carried a rifle, held at the ready, moving from cover to cover with the confidence of someone who knew the terrain. Too confident. Vasily did not fire. The range was long, the wind unpredictable. More importantly, something felt wrong. The movement was too exposed, too careless for someone of the German skill. This was bait. The soldier disappeared behind a collapsed wall. Vasily waited, scanning the surrounding area through his scope, searching for the real threat. His training, his instinct, every lesson his grandfather had taught him screamed that the danger was elsewhere. There, a glint of light, barely visible, from a window in a building 300 meters distant. Not the reflection of glass. There was no glass left in Stalingrad, but something else. A scope. A lens catching the weak winter sun for just a fraction of a second. The German had used a spotter, a decoy, to draw fire and reveal Vasily's position. It was textbook tactics, the kind taught in sniper schools to students who passed rigorous training. The kind of tactics Vasily had invented himself months ago, and that had apparently been studied and copied by the enemy. The irony was not lost on him. He shifted his aim to the distant window, moving with glacial slowness, keeping the rifle barrel hidden in shadow. At 300 meters, the shot would be nearly impossible. The bullet would drop significantly. The wind would push it off course. The margin for error was measured in millimeters. But Vasily had made impossible shots before. He waited, watching the window, patient as stone. Minutes passed. His muscles ached from immobility. His eyes watered from the strain of staring through the scope. Still he waited. Movement. The barest suggestion of it. A shadow shifting within shadows. The German was repositioning, perhaps believing his decoy had failed, perhaps preparing to withdraw and try again another day. Vasily exhaled halfway, held it. His heartbeat slowed to thunder in his ears. The crosshairs settled on the center of the window, adjusted slightly for windage, slightly for drop. His finger found the trigger, applied pressure smooth as silk. The world narrowed to the space between breaths, the moment between heartbeats. In that space, everything aligned: wind, target, rifle, shooter. In that space, there was no thought, no fear, no doubt, only the release. The Mosin Nagant roared. Through the scope, Vasily saw the window explode inward, saw the shadow jerk and fall. He did not celebrate, did not relax. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a fresh round, keeping his aim steady on the window. Long seconds passed. No return fire came, no movement in the window. But Vasily had learned not to trust absence of evidence. He waited 15 minutes, motionless, barely breathing. Then he carefully withdrew from his position, moving backwards on his belly, keeping rubble between himself and the German position. Only when he was deep in the ruins, hidden by multiple layers of cover, did he allow himself to sit up and take a full breath. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline finally releasing its hold. He had learned to control it during the shot, to become perfectly calm when it mattered most. But afterwards, the body demanded payment for that control. He waited until dark, then made his way through the ruins to the Soviet lines. At headquarters, he reported the contact, the shot, the probable kill. Chvikov listened without expression, then nodded. "We will send a patrol to confirm," the general said. "If you killed him, it will be a great victory for morale. And if I did not?" Chvikov had smiled without humor. "Then we continue the hunt." The patrol went out before dawn, moving through no man's land with the caution of men who understood they were expendable. They reached the building, entered through a collapsed wall, climbed rubble that had once been stairs. In a room on the 3rd floor, they found him. The German sniper lay sprawled across a makeshift bench, his rifle, a Mauser Kar-9 8K with a high-quality Zeiss scope, still gripped in dead hands. Vasily's bullet had struck him in the chest, slightly right of center, punching through ribs and lung and exiting his back in a spray of blood now frozen on the wall behind him. In his pockets, they found identification papers for a Hauptmann from Berlin, a letter from home, and a photograph of a woman and 2 children. His scope was confiscated, studied, and given to another Soviet sniper. His rifle was taken as a trophy. His body was left where it fell, another corpse in a city made of corpses. Vasily was told of the confirmation but felt no triumph. He had killed a skilled opponent, a man who might have been a teacher or a hunter in another life, a man who had left a family behind to serve his country, just as Vasily had left the mountains to serve his. The duel was over, but the war continued. There would be others. There were always others. The instructor. As November gave way to December, Vasily's tally of kills climbed. Each confirmed death was marked in a notebook kept by the political officers, numbers that would later appear in newspapers and propaganda films. By the end of the Stalingrad campaign, that number would reach 225, though some sources claim 242. The exact figure matters less than what it represented. A sustained campaign of precision killing that helped turn the tide in a battle that defined the war. But Vasily's greatest contribution was not his own kills but what he taught others. General Chvikov, recognizing the effectiveness of sniper tactics, ordered the creation of sniper schools within the city itself. Vasily became one of the primary instructors, teaching soldiers the methods he had developed through trial and error, through instinct refined by his grandfather's lessons, through the hard reality of daily survival, in conditions that should have made survival impossible. He taught them patience above all else, how to wait for hours without moving, how to ignore hunger and cold and fear, how to become part of the landscape so completely that the enemy's eyes would pass over them without recognition. He taught them to think like prey in order to hunt predators, to understand that the sniper's greatest weapon was not the rifle, but the mind. He taught them about positioning, to always have multiple escape routes, to never use the same hide twice, to understand that the perfect shot from an exposed position was worthless if it left you dead. He taught them about camouflage, not just visual, but behavioral, how to move without creating patterns, how to vary timing and location, and approach until predictability became impossible. He taught them about the rifle, about how cold affected the steel and the powder, how to maintain the weapon in conditions that destroyed lesser equipment, how to make adjustments for wind and distance and angle by feel rather than calculation. He taught them that a sniper who took 3 shots and killed 3 targets was better than one who took 10 shots and killed 5, because the additional 7 shots revealed position and created risk without producing results. Most importantly, he taught them that the sniper's war was psychological as much as physical. Every German officer who died made his replacement more cautious. Every machine gunner killed made his replacement fire blindly into shadows. Every radio man eliminated made communications more difficult and coordination more chaotic. The sniper's goal was not just to reduce enemy numbers, but to reduce enemy effectiveness, to make them afraid, to make them waste resources and time and energy defending against a threat that could strike from anywhere at any time. Many of his students died. The attrition rate for snipers in Stalingrad was astronomical. But those who survived became force multipliers themselves, spreading his tactics throughout the Red Army, creating a sniper culture that would haunt German forces for the remainder of the war. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army was encircled, trapped in the ruins of the city they had tried so hard to capture. Supplies ran low, ammunition dwindled, food became scarce. The cold intensified, dropping to temperatures where exposed skin froze in seconds, where diesel fuel solidified, where weapons ceased to function unless carefully maintained. The Germans began to surrender in groups, then in companies, then in divisions. On the 2nd of February 1943, the last elements of the Sixth Army capitulated. Of the nearly 300,000 German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, only about 90,000 survived to surrender. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would live to see Germany again. Vasily had survived, against odds that defied calculation, through a battle where life expectancy was measured in hours. He had not only survived but thrived, had become a symbol of Soviet resistance and German fear. But the war was not finished with him. The price. The Eastern Front in 1943 was a meat grinder, operating at industrial scale. After Stalingrad, the Red Army went on the offensive, pushing west with a determination born of 4 million dead and a rage that would not be satisfied until Berlin burned. Vasily continued to fight, his skills in demand, as the Wehrmacht retreated through Ukraine, through Belarus, through the Baltic states, and Poland. He trained more snipers. He took more shots. His total kill count climbed toward 468 confirmed kills by war's end. Though the exact number became harder to verify as the front became more fluid, as record-keeping broke down under the chaos of rapid advance. But every sniper understands that skill and luck are different things, and that luck eventually runs out. In January 1943, near Stalingrad, a German mortar barrage caught Vasily in the open. He had been moving between positions, had been perhaps a second too slow, had made the kind of minor error that killed men every day in a war where minor errors were fatal. The mortar round exploded close, not close enough to kill him, but close enough to shower him with shrapnel and blast debris. He felt the impact like a wall of pressure, felt himself thrown through the air, felt the world go white and then red and then black. When consciousness returned, he could not see. The blast had damaged his eyes, the pressure wave causing hemorrhaging that robbed him of vision. Medical staff evacuated him across the Volga, a journey he experienced only through sound and sensation, the rocking of the boat, the thunder of artillery, voices shouting orders he could not obey because he could not see where to move. At a field hospital, doctors examined him and delivered their verdict. The damage was severe, possibly permanent. they could do nothing. He was given medical discharge papers, a medal, and transportation to a hospital in Moscow. For a man who had survived on his vision, who had lived by his ability to see further and more clearly than his enemies, blindness was a death sentence of a different kind. He lay in a hospital bed, hands bandaged to prevent him from touching his damaged eyes, and contemplated a future that held no hunting, no mountains, no scope through which to read the world. But the Soviet Union had invested in Vasily Zaitsev, had made him a hero, and heroes were too valuable to discard. When word of his injury reached the highest levels, orders came down. He was to receive treatment from the best eye surgeon available, Professor Filatov in Odessa, a man whose skills were legendary. The surgery was delicate, dangerous, and uncertain. Filatov worked for hours, repairing torn tissue, relieving pressure, saving what could be saved. When the bandages finally came off, weeks later, Vasily could see again. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to walk without assistance, well enough to read, well enough to live something approximating a normal life. But his days as a sniper were over. The Soviet army reassigned him to training duties, where he continued to teach the tactics he had developed, where his experience became doctrine that was studied and implemented across all fronts. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, given medals and honors, his image reproduced on posters and in films. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a hunter who had lost his sight, a soldier who had survived when so many better men had died. The medals meant nothing. The honors meant nothing. What mattered was that the war continued, and he was no longer able to fight it. But he had done his part. In the ruins of Stalingrad, in the frozen hell where men died by the thousands every day, he had proven that skill and courage and patience could overcome technological superiority, could turn one man with a rifle into a force that shaped the course of battle. The memory. The war ended in May 1945, with Berlin in ruins and Nazi Germany defeated. Vasily returned to civilian life, taking a job, managing a factory in Kiev, far from the mountains where he had learned to shoot, far from the ruins of Stalingrad where he had become a legend. He married, had children, lived the quiet life of a Soviet citizen in a country rebuilding itself from ashes. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked about his experiences, he would give brief answers devoid of glory or pride. He had done what was necessary. Others had done more. The real heroes were the ones who never came home. But the war had marked him in ways that went beyond his damaged eyes. He dreamed of Stalingrad, of frozen corpses and burning buildings, of the German sniper in the window, of all the faces he had seen through his scope in the instant before the trigger pull. He could not forget them, did not want to forget them, because forgetting seemed like betrayal. In the decades after the war, historians and journalists sought him out, asking for his story, for details about the duel with the German sniper, for insights into how one man could kill so many. He cooperated within limits, but always made clear that his story was not unique. Thousands of snipers had fought on the Eastern Front. Many had killed more than him. Many had displayed greater courage. What made his story compelling, he thought, was not his skill but his survival. The simple fact that he had lived when probability said he should have died a dozen times over. That was not skill. That was luck. And luck was not something to be celebrated but acknowledged, with humility and gratitude to those whose luck had run out. He wrote a memoir, Notes of a Sniper, published in the Soviet Union and later translated into multiple languages. It became a bestseller, was adapted into films and television, inspired generations of military historians and writers. But Vasily himself remained ambivalent about the attention. The war had been real. The book was just words. The films were just images. They could not capture the cold, or the fear, or the weight of taking a life, even an enemy's life, even when that life was trying to take yours. In his later years, he returned to the mountains when he could, to the forests where his grandfather had taught him to hunt. He could no longer shoot with his old precision, his eyes would not permit it, but he could still walk among the pines, could still feel the wind and read the signs of animal passage, could still remember what it felt like to be young and certain and alive. On the 15th of December 1991, at the age of 76, Vasily Grigoryevich Zaitsev died in Kiev. The Soviet Union he had fought for would collapse within days, fragmenting into independent republics, ending the empire he had helped preserve at such terrible cost. He was buried in Volgograd, the city formerly known as Stalingrad, on Mamayev Kurgan, the hilltop that had been the scene of some of the fiercest fighting of the battle. His grave overlooks the Volga, overlooks the city he had helped defend, overlooks the ruins that have been rebuilt into a modern metropolis where people live and work and raise children without ever knowing what happened in those streets. But some remember, veterans gather there on Victory Day, fewer every year, their numbers diminishing as time does what war could not. They remember the cold and the hunger and the fear. They remember friends who died in their arms, positions held against impossible odds, small victories that together constituted the larger victory that saved the world from fascism. And they remember snipers like Vasily Zaitsev, who proved that in the modern era of tanks and artillery and air power, a single skilled individual could still matter, could still change the course of battle through patience and precision, and the willingness to become something more than human. A hunter who stalked not animals but other hunters, in a contest where second place meant death. The legacy. The Mosin Nagant rifle Vasily used in Stalingrad was not preserved. It was a tool, used until it wore out, or was lost, or was replaced by a newer model. Somewhere in the ruins of the Eastern Front, it corroded and crumbled, returned to the earth like the millions of men who had carried similar rifles into similar battles. But the tactics survived. The methods survived. The understanding that a sniper is not merely a skilled shooter, but a psychologist, a hunter, a student of human nature who uses the rifle as one tool among many, that understanding became doctrine, was codified in training manuals, was taught to generations of military marksmen across the world. Modern snipers study Zaitsev's methods. They learn about patience and positioning, about psychological warfare, and the value of a single well-placed shot. They learn that the sniper's war is not about glory or medals or kill counts, but about accomplishing the mission through superior knowledge and execution. They learn that in war, as in hunting, the most important skill is not pulling the trigger, but knowing when to pull it, and knowing when to wait, and knowing when to withdraw without firing at all. They learn that the sniper who survives is not the one who takes the most chances, but the one who takes the right chances at the right times. And they learn about Stalingrad, the frozen hell, where men fought with a desperation that exceeded all previous understanding of human endurance, where the life expectancy was measured in hours, but some men survived months, where the difference between life and death was often nothing more than a moment's hesitation or a second's luck. Vasily Zaitsev's story has been told in books and films, has been studied by military historians and psychologists, has been mythologized and analyzed and debated. Some details have been questioned, some statistics disputed, some events reframed by historians, with access to archives that were sealed during the Soviet era. But the core truth remains. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, in the ruins of a city that became a symbol of resistance, a young man from the Ural Mountains used a rifle and the skills his grandfather taught him to become one of the most effective snipers in military history. He killed hundreds of enemy soldiers, trained hundreds more Soviet snipers, and helped turn the tide in a battle that changed the course of the war. He did not do it for glory. He did it because it needed to be done, because he had the skills to do it, because others depended on him to do it. When the war was over, he returned to civilian life with gratitude that he had survived, and grief for those who had not. He understood what many forget, that war is not an abstraction, not a game played with maps and statistics, but a human experience of profound suffering and occasional transcendence, where ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things under conditions that should make those things impossible. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes they succeed. Epilogue. The winter wind. The wind still blows across Mamayev Kurgan, carrying with it the memory of gunfire and the silence that followed. The city below has grown, has prospered, has become a place where young people live without understanding what was bought for them here. But on the hilltop, among the monuments and memorials, the memory persists. Names carved in stone, thousands upon thousands of names, each one representing a life that ended in defense of this place. Among them, though his name is also carved elsewhere, is Vasily Zaitsev, not because he was the greatest soldier, or the most decorated, or the most celebrated, but because his story captured something essential about the battle and the war and the people who fought it. He was a hunter who became a soldier who became a legend who became a man again, living quietly with the memories of what he had done and what had been done to him and around him. He carried those memories with grace and humility, understanding that survival was not virtue but chance, that heroism was not measured in kill counts, but in the willingness to do what duty demanded, even when every instinct screamed to flee. The rifle he carried is gone, crumbled to rust somewhere in the vastness of Russia. The men he killed are gone, buried in foreign soil or lost in mass graves, or returned home to families who mourned them. The war he fought is history now, studied by people who will never know the cold or the fear or the weight of taking a life. But the lesson remains that in the darkest moments, when everything seems lost and survival seems impossible, individuals can still matter. A single person with skill and courage and determination can still change outcomes, can still inspire others, can still prove that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Vasily Zaitsev proved it in the ruins of Stalingrad, one shot at a time, one day at a time, one small victory at a time, until small victories became large ones, and the tide turned and the war was won. And somewhere in the mountains, in forests that care nothing for human conflicts, the wind still moves through the pines the way it did when a young shepherd first learned to shoot, first learned to wait, first learned that patience and skill together could overcome size and strength and numbers. The hunt continues. It always continues. And the lessons learned in blood and snow remain relevant as long as conflict exists, as long as individuals must face overwhelming odds with nothing but skill and will and the refusal to surrender. That is the legacy of Vasily Zaitsev. Not the kill count, not the medals, not the propaganda. The legacy is simpler and more profound. That one person, in the right place at the right time with the right skills, can still matter, can still make a difference, can still change history. Even in hell, especially in hell, the wind blows, the river flows, the city lives. And on the hilltop, the hunter rests, his work done, his story told, his memory preserved for as long as people remember that freedom has a price, and that sometimes that price is paid by ordinary people doing extraordinary things in places where death is commonplace and survival is miraculous. Vasily Grigoryevich Zaitsev, born the 23rd of March, 1915, in the Ural Mountains, died the 15th of December, 1991, in Kiev, buried in Volgograd, overlooking the city he helped save. Hunter, soldier, teacher, legend, man, remembered.